Great. Yeah. So thanks again for the introduction. Yeah, we're just happy to be here today to talk with you about utility planning. It really is probably one of the best opportunities in the power sector to advocate for decarbonization, consumer protections, and social equity. So many of you are probably already engaged in some aspects of planning where you are. And so you might be quite familiar with a lot of what we'll raise today. We're going to focus on the fundamentals of robust utility system planning. And so our plan is just to start with why planning is so important. Then we'll talk through some typical and evolving planning processes. We'll cover some best practices. So some things to look out for in planning where you are, or if it doesn't exist there, what you might want to encourage. And then we'll focus back on participation in planning proceedings. So I'm going to trade off today with Jessica. We're going to just go back and forth with slides. And as Maggie mentioned earlier, if questions come up, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll definitely get to them, if not during the presentation, during the discussion time after. We have plenty of time. So our first slide is all about key takeaways. So some things that we hope that you walk away with today. The first being that regulatory oversight over utility planning, it's really not about making exactly the correct decision. It's not really about precision in decision making, but it's really about implementing the sound and transparent planning processes. So it's about using reasonable business practices to lead to robust outcomes. We're going to talk through some very separate processes that are existing today for generation, transmission, distribution on the electric side. We'll also talk about gas utilities. But then, the next point here is that distributed energy resources have really become a key driver that's really leading to the need to integrate these electric planning processes. As well as climate goals and climate targets, really driving towards merging all of these processes. And then the last point, that stakeholder engagement leads to better decisions. That's really a key factor for today. So with that, I think we'll kick it right over to Jessica to lead us to why good planning is so important.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. And thanks everyone for being here today. So we wanted to start with just some context and kind of where have we been and what is the reason why we think that we all should care about good planning. So some reasons here to share with you on this slide. Planning helps provide a coordinated view of the utility's future and also a roadmap to get there, specifically how to get more robust outcomes through sound decision making, as Elaine was just saying, and through these transparent and robust planning and procurement processes. It affects so many things that we all care about: affordability, reliability and resilience, emissions, environmental justice, just among a few. This is really an area, as Elaine said, of utility regulation where stakeholder engagement is typically pretty robust and where there are significant opportunities to influence the assumptions that the utility is making and also the ultimate plan that gets adopted by the utility or proposed to the commission. And then perhaps most importantly, it can help us avoid some costly outcomes or mistakes that might be made if we weren't undertaking such a robust and transparent process. And that gets to kind of the context of the origins of utility planning. And it really emerged in response to some costly decisions in the 70s and 80s, where utilities were significantly overestimating load growth, underestimating the costs of particularly new nuclear units, and lots of money was getting invested in projects that were ultimately not needed. This picture is of a nuclear plant in New York. The final construction cost was 15 times the original estimate. And this plant was never needed, and so it never actually went into commercial operation. So these are the kinds of sort of planning and procurement mistakes that integrated resource planning was really set up to ideally prevent and address. And planning used to be a lot simpler, mostly because the grid was also a lot simpler in the sort of initial days of when in the 70s and 80s when planning got going. There were one-way power flows. So the load side of the equation was assumed to be immovable. Utilities scheduled and dispatched generation to satisfy that load. It was not assumed to be flexible in any way. The utilities planned their generation, transmission, and distribution to meet that forecasted customer demand. And so things like IRP, so integrated resource planning, was established to primarily address resource adequacy, in response to state regulation that was cropping up. Transmission planning was conducted for reliability purposes in response to both state and federal regulation of transmission planning. And then distribution system planning was done, mostly handled by the utilities internally for reliability and power quality, with some oversight by the commission for things like major expenditures through rate cases, so through prudence determinations, et cetera. But today, so the planning has gotten much more complex thanks to the grid becoming much more complex, and planning has become even more important as a result. Now today we have multi-way power flows, we have flexible loads, so the demand side of the equation can now in many cases be scheduled and planned instead of being immovable. So balancing of generation and load can happen at either end, either at the supply side or the demand side, or both. The utilities are still responsible for planning generation, transmission, and distribution to meet forecasted customer demand, but that forecasting itself has become much more complicated. It has to account for customer investments and the impact of things like customers investing in distributed solar on things like net load. So grid needs have become different, and the solution set has also changed. We have flexible load pricing, other programs utilities can run that can change the solution set. Another reason for planning becoming more important is that distribution costs are steadily going up. You can see in this graph, the dark blue sections of the bars is the distribution CapEx amount, and the proportion is also going up. So the proportion of utility CapEx spending that's going to the distribution system is going up. And so there's becoming more interest in understanding what those investments are and doing a bit more detailed planning and analysis, making it more transparent what the costs are being spent on. And also, reliability and resilience are becoming even more of a concern in really all over the country. And these are primarily distribution system problems as well. This graph is a little bit old. It shows the average minutes of outage per customer in 2017 for Michigan's utilities. So you can see that most Michigan utilities, the vast majority, had more than 200 minutes of outages per customer in that year, which exceeded the resource adequacy standard of 2.4 hours. And this trend is not unique to Michigan. And with the increasing prevalence of extreme weather events and concerns around our increasing reliance on the electric system, reliability and resilience are becoming primary concerns for regulators. And so interest in distribution system planning is increasing in addition for this reason. And there, as Elaine mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about gas utilities. There are now reasons to be looking at gas utility planning more closely as well. There's a trend toward building electrification driven by a number of different factors. The graph shows just the effect of building homes to more updated codes. So the blue bars show annual usage in therms for homes built to the 2006 code, and then the green bars show the same homes for the 2018 code, or the same size homes. So this is just one switch in code policy driving a reduction in gas use in homes of all sizes. There's also pipeline constraints affecting supply planning, but primarily an East Coast concern. There are new questions about how gas utilities will comply with climate policy. There's proposals being floated around alternative gases and questions raised about the need to reduce load or throughput on the gas system to comply with climate constraints. And then all of this is raising new questions for regulators that planning can help address. So there's, for example, the potential for load to decline on the gas system, but specifically how much and when and where. How will gas and electric system peaks be changing, and will they be seasonally shifting? And what should we make of these alternative gas proposals? Will they become available and in what quantity and at what cost? So these are all questions that we're starting to see crop up and reasons why we think robust utility planning on the gas side as well is so important nowadays. So back over to you, Elaine.
Okay, great. Yeah, so types of planning. So, you know, we know it's important, but how do we do it today? How does this play out? And so really with any utility planning, there are some just basic objectives that you're going to see. So, I mean, first off, it's critical that any plan is designed to achieve really all of the policy or regulatory requirements in that jurisdiction. So, you know, I put up here safe, reliable, affordable. Those are pretty consistent across states. Equitable, clean, resilient. You know, there may be other types of policy goals or commission requirements that pertain directly to your jurisdiction, but ultimately planning really needs to just meet some fundamental criteria like that. And then, you know, within those required constraints, it's all about figuring out what is that optimal mix of, you know, it's either new resources or it's some specific utility actions that they plan to take that combined will minimize the costs and the risks of meeting that short and long-term customer need. So those are pretty much the basics that apply really in any type of planning. It's also kind of nice to step back and, you know, think about, well, what are the roles involved in these processes. So, you know, just to start off with customers and advocates. So from their perspective, you know, thinking about the energy system, want it to be affordable, equitable, reliable, clean, resilient, and, you know, we could go on with more adjectives there, but, you know, taking into mind like that perspective, but then overlapping that with from the utility perspective, their obligation to provide safe, reliable, and affordable services. But also keep in mind, you know, from an investor and utility perspective, they're going to want to maximize their profit while doing so. So, you know, the third sort of leg of the stool there is from the regulator perspective of oversight of utility business practices. But, you know, making sure that the planning is done in a public process and that public interest, you know, particularly, you know, the customers and advocates, that they are represented in planning. So a little more about like types of planning, and, you know, starting on the electric side here, this is a pretty basic graphic of the electric system. Really can think about dividing it into three sections. The first focusing on generating stations, sort of, you know, the bulk power system, and transmission, and then ultimately the distribution system up to the customer. So the first area of focus and generation here is probably where there's most history, or what you might be familiar with integrated resource planning. And this is really what Jessica started mentioning about, you know, the growth in the 1980s or so. It's a little bit deceptive here to, you know, just focus on the generating station, kind of thinking that it's disaggregated from the customer. But really, in this type of planning, IRP planning, it's all about matching that generation to the customer load in aggregate. So we'll talk about the distribution system planning a little bit, which is more granular and location-wise, but in IRP planning really is taking all of the customer load together. So step back a little bit. What is IRP? It is a very public regulatory process to develop that long-term vision or plan of resource development in the utilities territory. It's used to evaluate the least cost portfolio strategies that are going to deliver a reliable service over the next, it's usually 10 to 20 years, while considering all the risks and achieving, policy mandates and requirements that I mentioned earlier. It's required in many states. It's pretty popular. It's in 36 states by either law or regulation, but each state kind of considers IRP a little bit different. So from a commission's view, when a utility files their plan, their integrated resource plan, the commission might think of it or review it from different levels of rigor. The first would be just to accept the plan. Do they check the boxes? Does it meet the plan? Or they might acknowledge it. So that means, do they think it's a reasonable approach? But approving it is kind of the most rigorous sort of level of standards. Other elements that come up, so customer load projections, of course, more in aggregate, as I mentioned, customer side resources, again, in aggregate, are represented, and utility side resources. There we go. Okay, and the next segment of the grid to focus on the transmission system. So this is all about moving, large-scale utility generation to the customers. Many aspects of transmission planning is actually included in integrated resource planning. That's more from the utility perspective and trying to get that generation that they just planned to the customer. But really, transmission planning is a mechanism to ensure that there's adequate transmission capacity on the bulk power transmission system that's going to meet reliability standards. I wanted to also highlight here that there are shared responsibilities and oversight over transmission planning. So it's not just the state commission that plays some role in transmission planning, but it's really a federal role of Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that has most of the responsibility here. This is an example of where, in Minnesota, it would be the local commission that has oversight over the construction of transmission and thinking through how that transmission sort of fits with the regulated utility plan. But it's FERC that is ultimately working on regional planning with and regional reliability projects. So in that case, PUC is just kind of a stakeholder in the role. This third segment of the electric system, the distribution system. And here, I think a lot of the slides that Jessica talked us through and about the need for evolution really focused on distribution system. That's really where most of the change is felt for customers in particular. Traditionally, distribution system planning has been not very transparent. It's been mostly the utility, investing in the system, upgrading the system, expanding to meet new customer load, but doing so more in an operational perspective. Typically, very little regulatory oversight and not much public participation at all. And utilities have always really had to do planning on the distribution system, to meet reliability needs. Requests for new investments were really considered part of the regular course of running business. So main changes to the system and the way we're using our energy system are driving the need to really reform planning here. So with increasing bidirectional flow, new technologies to optimize system dispatch, to optimize maintenance of the distribution system and upgrades really allow for optimizing the integration of distributed energy resources. But I have to keep the system affordability in mind too. So this next slide here is just an illustration of really the evolved distribution planning, calling it integrated distribution system planning. It has some different names in different states. So I think in some states they've stuck with distribution system planning, but integrated has become more of like what you'll see with the Department of Energy as they talk about, how to evolve the system, trying to shift towards the use of integrated. So this illustration, let's see. How about I start with the load and DER forecasting. So in typical utility distribution planning, they have forecasted load, but now it's much more critical that distributed energy resources are integrated into that forecasting. So what are the effects of energy efficiency on the system? What's the forecast for for customer distributed resource acquisition? And so how does that whole combination of forecasting new DERs impact load? So it's really the net load that we're looking for here. After load forecasting, it's kind of a step of assessing the system. And here we've added this step recently of hosting capacity analysis. So it's really it's a process, a way of communicating and making transparent what is the ability of the current system to take on new resources, new distributed generation, or where you might need some system upgrades prior to that happening. The big connection there that then leads to, well, what's the value? What are the grid needs and the locational value on various parts of the system? And then identifying solutions. Now that solution identification has expanded beyond just the typical utility system view of adding new reclosers or adding some new real traditional investment to include non-wires alternatives. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but targeted alternatives that can reduce distribution system costs. Moves into project design and construction, and then being able to monitor your system. We have much more intelligence, and better communications, control, system sensing capabilities out there that really just lead to overall optimization of the system. So just a nice graphic just to show really what's going on in the utility perspective. But there, with IDP, some real key concepts here is to start off with some well-articulated objectives. So it's going to be slightly different, in every jurisdiction or so, but same sense of, well, what's important to the commission, what's important to stakeholders in that territory. In some areas, distribution system planning has an element of increasing competition, so bringing in third-party providers maybe. But overall, it's typically for improving reliability and preparing the system for increased distributed energy resources. Planning also includes grid modernization here. So some really fundamental investments are needed to enable those advanced grid capabilities to be able to integrate distributed energy resources. This graphic here is taken directly from Xcel Energy's Integrated Distribution Plan in 2021. This is really the outcome of distribution system planning process, which is a roadmap that starts where they are today and starts to lay out, well, how do they think they're going to need to invest in the system to be able to provide capabilities to better integrate distributed energy resources in the future. And this plan is taking a holistic systems approach, but it's also considering affordability of the system too. So, maybe you don't do all of this at once, but there is a logical sort of prioritization and a way to think through how best to achieve these capabilities on the system. So looks complicated here, but it's really just shining a light into this what used to be just a black box on the distribution system. So shifting to the gas utilities, I know that the last webinar was about gas modernization. We should note that typical gas planning has been pretty discrete, and pretty different processes that might not be as interconnected to each other, and can really fall short of public interest needs. So very separate processes. They also have some pretty limited risk analysis in the past. Again, lacking transparency. And last point is that gas planning has really always been disconnected from electric planning. As you know, it's a lot more critical that we are now connecting the two due to fuel switching. And so this leads me to this plot here, this graphic, where this is really the ideal. So, thinking about what the electric system has gone through with IRP, transmission planning, distribution system planning, and how they're just much more better coordinated to each other, that the gas system should also be going through kind of a similar process. So, and not just better connecting all of the individual parts of the gas system planning, but also connecting to electric planning here visible. We're not seeing a whole lot of that just yet, but we're seeing much better awareness of the need for it. And there are some specific examples. Various states have a lot of proceedings underway to look into gas planning in much more detail. I wanted to just share a couple examples of some pretty recent decisions, Colorado and in California, where a new approach here is gas infrastructure pre-approval. So before a rate case, before a utility does invest in infrastructure, that they receive some, go through an approval process in order to be able to spend those funds. Kind of like bringing a mini planning session forward, but like in real time, real actionable. So that's pretty new. Okay. So I'm going to shift over to best practices. This next slide really are just showing that IRP is, I think I mentioned earlier, is in 36 states or so. It is widespread. It's really well adopted. Also, I think distribution system planning, or IDP, certainly more than I think half the states or so have some level of an advanced IDP in the works. And I think that just we're seeing much more familiarity with the issues. Also, maybe 10 states, maybe a little bit more than that, have some open gas planning proceedings as well. So with all those states involved in some level of planning, a lot of best practices emerge across each of the different types. I think I have about 6 slides or so that talk through some of kind of the top best practices that you might want to look out for. The first one is about building equity into planning. So we're seeing greater integration of equity considerations. It's still pretty new, and there's still a lot to figure out, mostly because a lot of it relies upon data, and there's some lack of data right now. It seems to be the main concern. But building equity into planning is really starting with creating an inclusive and authentic stakeholder process. And have this happen before and after the plans are filed too. Jessica's going to go into more about stakeholder process, but that's just kind of like first thing to keep in mind. Another aspect of building equity into planning, it's really about what we would traditionally do is just look for technical solutions. Right? It's all about finding the solution to the problem, putting people aside. So putting the customer aside. What's the best technical solution to meet the grid need? But now we're finding that that's not that's really not going to meet what we want out of our energy system in the future. So this is all about expanding your look at technical solutions and think about how the cost of those solutions and the benefits of those solutions will be distributed throughout the system. So what's the impact to various customer segments of carrying out that plan? So this is going to matter even more in the future. One way we can help augmenting equity in planning is to think about what are some meaningful metrics that we might want to look into. And think about our baseline system of how those costs and benefits are distributed. And think about maybe some incentive mechanisms that could build out of planning. Targeting distributed energy resource programs, that's another sort of outcome of planning, and thinking about equity as you do so. Another best practice of planning is that you consider all of the feasible options. Fair consideration of supply and demand side resources. This has been a theme of planning since the 80s, just making sure that it's not all about the utility owning a resource. Could be that there's a third party that the utility could procure that generation from, and would be, to the betterment of consumers. So it's, thinking about, well, there could be different options. We have to make sure that we're thinking of them all equally, or evaluating them on an equal basis. So central resources versus distributed. Think about the costs, the benefits, and the risks of all of them. This next best practice is pretty related to the one I just mentioned, but non-wires or non-pipeline solutions. Here, utilities are now more and more being required to consider targeting demand-side actions or investments as alternatives to traditional supply and distribution investments. So some examples here could be to really target an energy efficiency program in a certain location to lower the load in the area, could result in deferring a new substation, as an example. Or a geothermal heat pump network could greatly reduce pressure in a pipeline, could avoid investment of some new capacity. So this is becoming much more common, and I think the guidance to utilities is becoming much more standardized as to what the Commission is looking to see when they're evaluating pipeline or non-wires, non-pipeline solutions. Next one, any planning, there's always uncertainty in the future, but if there's any utility plan that doesn't consider uncertainty, clearly that's a red flag. What we, best practice would dictate is that we want to practice risk-aware regulation. So having a conversation, open, having transparency, and identifying and evaluating likelihood and impact of risk is really important. A lot of work over the years gone into improving risk modeling. So we have much better tools today, a lot more data, a lot more processing capability. And so you'll see risk modeling sensitivities, taking fuel prices, load forecasts, hydro availability, and sort of stressing your assumptions there, using those in the models to kind of see how the chosen sort of portfolio of resources and actions is going to perform based on how each of those really key assumptions might vary. So it really gives you a chance to stress test the portfolio and really see where are the risks to consumers? What do we really need to look out for? Another way of doing this is to come up with some scenarios. So you can come up with like a high beneficial electrification scenario, and that's going to involve sort of adjusting several of those assumptions there. Next best practice, just defining some short-term actions, those actions in the next 2 to 4 years that are going to move you towards achieving the long-term goals. Things like energy efficiency programs. There might be some studies that the utility wants to take on to better prepare for the next planning cycle. They could start working on retirement of resources, have a schedule for releasing an all-source RFP. Those are all just examples of what you might see in there. really, another great thing about this action plan is that it's going to give you this heads up or kind of a preview to what types of costs you might see show up in future rate cases. So, and then finally, really the need to align all of the various planning processes. So, here, thinking about assumptions that are used in each of the different planning processes, making sure they're connected. So things like load forecasts, distributed energy resource forecasts that are going to impact your net load. Other types of assumptions like resource capabilities and costs, how they're going to make decisions. Other similar aspects should all be considered together. And then finally, like in a perfect world, it's not just electric utility planning or gas planning, but it's really like all of these societal planning areas really need to overlap and no longer be in their silos. So they all do impact each other. So that's what we're all moving towards anyway. And with that, I think next we're going to focus on participation.
Hey, Elaine, there was one question that I wasn't totally sure the answer to, so I thought I would just ask you it really quickly before we move on, if that's okay. It goes back to your slide about Colorado and California, the pre-approval for gas infrastructure. The question is, how does gas pre-approval differ from a CPCN proceeding, or is that for non-generating infrastructure? And I think what I said is that I think the pre-approval process that you're talking about here is for non-generating gas distribution infrastructure, but I wasn't sure because I don't know about these two decisions.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, these specific decisions are about putting in new pipeline, expanding pipeline for like a certain amount of cost, above a certain amount of cost, but it's new in the fact that it requires upfront approval to get this. So that's just why I wanted to highlight it as being something a little bit different. But I think your answer is exactly, what I would have answered too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, so our last section of the presentation today is just to talk about participation in planning processes and to hopefully create some enthusiasm among you all for participating in planning proceedings, as we think that stakeholder input is a really important aspect of all the processes that Elaine talked about. So in the US, most IRP processes allow for public input from anyone who wants to express an opinion. And there's lots of sort of opportunities for feedback. You can provide input on the assumptions and also on just the planning processes itself. Many participation processes allow for public participation before and after the plan is drafted. So there's kind of multiple touch points within the process. They're mostly done in a pretty transparent way with things like the key documents, data sets, et cetera, made available on the internet. And we just want to emphasize that this input is really important to make sure that the utility will ultimately reflect the interests of ratepayers and the general public in the final plan that gets filed with the commission. And as you all know, local governments and local activists have been leading the way on climate action for many years now. There are ambitious goals, there's plans at the local level, implementing changes over the things that they can control. However, there's often no direct control over the utility, and so there's indirect methods that need to be employed to make changes. And combine that with the ongoing kind of cultural awakening to the deep intersection between the power sector and pervasive impacts of historical inequities. things like power plant siting, coal ash disposal, rate design, all of these things have started to garner increased attention for their impact on underserved communities. And so all of this is leading to a growing awareness of the importance of PUC processes in general, and local governments and activists are getting increasingly sort of interested in looking towards the utility regulatory space to ensure that our publicly regulated utilities are better serving the public interest. Multiple guides have been recently produced giving insight into how to engage in utility planning processes, including one that we contributed to, which I will talk about in just a minute. But I think just to, I guess at a high level, keep in mind that when thinking about how to engage with your PUC, keeping in mind that PUCs are quasi-judicial bodies, so they don't operate in the same way, for example, as a city council. Commissioners need evidence and perspective on the record to respond to. So specific methodological comments go a long way to helping commissioners make decisions. These can be hard for organizations to file that might be capacity constrained, that don't have a technical expert on staff, but they're highly effective at making arguments to the PUC and helping regulators understand your perspective and your goals, and have the commissioners have a more robust record for making their decisions. So this graphic is, I believe, from, actually, I don't know if it's from a wrap paper or not, but it just shows how IRPs are developed in the blue boxes on the left, kind of the typical steps of IRP. And the point here is just to say that stakeholder engagement is important throughout. So you have the general steps of the process on the left in blue, and then there are opportunities for comment and engagement, such as just directly talking to the utility, publicly commenting, potentially becoming an intervener throughout that whole process. And I mentioned a wrap paper on this topic a couple of years ago. We contributed to a guide with IMT on reading and responding to IRPs, and we specifically addressed this for advocates and for local governments. It covers 9 key priorities of those two groups related to equity, social justice, and climate policy, and includes specific tips for how to read and respond to an IRP. So I encourage you to look here for tips on how to specifically engage utilities on these topics. And then so far, I've been mostly referring to participating in IRP, but processes for participating in DSP, while historically not as well established, there's a growing interest and even new requirements in many states for DSP to include very robust opportunities for stakeholder engagement, even potentially more emphasis on broadening engagement opportunities than with IRP in some cases. And there's similar kinds of opportunities for input around critiquing the assumptions that the utilities are using, looking at the different forecasts, the different scenarios that the utility might be planning to forecast, providing inputs on the goals and the relevant constraints for the plan. So what are the policy constraints, community priorities, and then the opportunity for formal comment or even intervener status is becoming more common. And then just a few examples on the slide of states where there are new opportunities starting to crop up. These are just examples. There's others as well, but Hawaii, New Hampshire, and New York have different types of public engagement, including things like technical advisory panels, working groups, surveys, newsletters, webinars. So there's lots of different methods being employed, and just kind of opening up the opportunities in a really robust way to engage on DSP. And with that, I think we're wrapping up.
Yeah, sounds good. So we're back to your key takeaways. So, just to reinforce that the planning process is really focused on robust outcomes. So it's having good processes in place, transparent, and participation important. Lots of separate processes today that are important, but they're improving, they're evolving, and I think a key part of that is better connecting them to each other. Distributed resources, a key driver that's really pushing the need to better understand what the impacts of electrification, reliability, climate impacts are on the grid, how to prepare the grid to continue reliable service. And then finally, stakeholder engagement. So Jessica has some great resources there that we hope that you find useful and you might want to check out. But with that, we're all set. We do have, or we'll provide the slides, and there are additional slides in at the end there if you want to explore a little bit further. So thank you. And are there any questions or anything? I didn't see anything more in the chat right now. Or in the, something in the Q&A. So question, do you have any good resources for helping a PUC keep proceedings as accessible as possible while resolving issues in a contested case? So one thing that comes to mind, Jessica, you might know more on this, is Dave worked on for, I think, North Carolina, some process there. Would that speak to contested case?
That was not specific to contested cases. That was more of a resource for just generally for, we do have the thing that Elaine is referring to. We have a general resource for state agencies for how to make general processes and kind of rulemakings and other proceedings as accessible as possible. I think there would be relevant advice in there for contested cases, but it's not specific to a contested case.
Yeah, I think that is probably the other nice thing about like the planning venue is that they're typically not contested, and they do allow for great accessibility, not having to apply for intervener status in some cases necessarily.
Yeah.
Okay. Oregon PUC engaging in investigation House Bill 2021. Want to move forward with a contested case, but you want to keep it as open as possible. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So I think the implication then of these two kind of comments and questions is that the contested case becomes much more legal in nature, becomes a higher hurdle for participation. And that's, as Elaine was saying, one of the benefits of the IRP and DSP processes is that they tend to not be contested cases and just can be engaged in by a regular kind of policy staff member from your organizations and don't necessarily need legal representation to share your perspective. So that's one benefit. And I think one of the reasons why we encourage organizations like yours to get involved in planning processes, because they are one of the more accessible.
And the next question about how is RAP working with state advocacy groups? I think, through venues like this, but Jess, you might have other examples there of how RAP is participating with advocacy organizations.
Yeah, we don't, because we're a national organization and we're pretty small, we don't actually have the bandwidth to really engage in state-specific advocacy, and RAP is not typically thought of itself as an advocacy organization. So we usually, the way we work with state advocacy groups is through things like this, where we get a chance to share our thinking and share best practices and hopefully enable better participation by state advocacy groups, but we don't sort of directly do advocacy ourselves.
And Linda, could you clarify your question a little bit here? So you mentioned that there are 8 states, asking if all 8 states are included. Is there a website for additional state info?
There was a slide earlier that you referred to, 36 states included in, let me see if I can find that.
Oh, in IRP.
Yes, exactly. And then, and so then you commented on that. And my thought was, since Midwest Building Decarbonization consists of 8 states, are those 8 states included in those 36 states that you referred to?
Got
And then
it.
the response I got was there's a map, but I still want to know specifically, is Indiana included? And is there a website for additional state information? I just trying to connect the dots.
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, right. So we do show, like, from this map in Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, that there are IRP processes, and probably the best way to learn more about what's going on in the state would be to go to the website of the State Regulatory Commission. So like Minnesota, for example, they do have some great information on their website, pretty easily accessible, searchable, which is another challenging part when you look at states. Everyone has a very different approach on their website. I think, well, Wisconsin does not have an IRP. Looks like Indiana does, though. So, I mean, I think my advice, I have not worked with Indiana, but would be to check out their commission website. And maybe we could do a little searching for you too, and send that link along in the meantime.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions kind of pop up in the chat or in the Q&A. I think you guys did a great job answering them, and then just a wonderful overview with this presentation as well. So I don't think there's anything else. So I think we could be good to go ahead and wrap today. Thanks so much for being here.
Sure.
Great.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
right.
thank you so much.